In the shadow of Mount Olympus, where mist clings to ancient oaks and the morning light filters through valleys of wild heather, a child was born who would one day reach for the edges of the known world. The summer air in Pella was warm and heavy, with the scent of cypress when, in July of 356 BCE, the cry of a newborn prince echoed through the royal chambers. Alexander, son of Philip II and Olympias, drew his first breath in a land of contrasts, a Macedonia of rugged mountains and gentle meadows, of warrior kings and philosophical whispers. Imagine the soft golden light of those northern Greek summers, how it played across the stone courtyards where the young prince took his earliest steps. The Macedonian heartland was not like the refined city-states to the south. Here the mountains rose like guardians, their peaks often crowned with snow, even as the lowland meadows bloomed with wildflowers. The palace at Pella stood proud above the fertile plain, its white columns catching the morning light, while fountains sang in courtyards scented with rosemary and thyme. Young Alexander grew in this landscape of dualities, the refinement of royal halls alongside the rugged wilderness that bred the finest cavalry in Greece. His childhood echoed these contrasts. From his mother Olympias, a princess of Epirus, he inherited passionate intensity and a connection to mystical traditions. She would whisper to him tales of heroes and gods, of Achilles whose fame would never die. From his father Philip, the ambitious king who transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom to a rising power, Alexander learned pragmatism, military strategy, and political cunning. The boy's education formally began as it did for all noble Macedonian youth, learning to read, to play the lyre, to ride, to fight, and to hunt. But Philip had greater ambitions for his heir. When Alexander reached the age of 13, his father sought out the greatest mind in Greece to shape his son's intellect. And so arrived Aristotle, student of Plato, master of knowledge. Picture a quiet glade near Pella, where the philosopher and his royal pupil walked beneath whispering leaves, the teacher's voice gentle yet precise as he unfolded the mysteries of logic, ethics, politics, and the natural world. For 3 formative years, from age 13 to 16, Alexander absorbed Aristotle's teachings on everything from poetry to zoology, from ethics to dreams. The philosopher instilled in him a love of Homer, especially the Iliad, with its tales of heroic glory won on distant shores. Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, a gift from his mentor, annotated by Aristotle's own hand. Within its verses he found his model in Achilles, beautiful, brilliant, doomed to a short but glorious life. In quiet evenings, as oil lamps cast soft shadows across the walls, the prince would recite passages, his voice rising and falling, with the rhythm of ancient deeds and godly interventions. Yet Aristotle's influence went beyond literature. He taught Alexander to observe the world carefully, to categorize and understand its patterns. Together they dissected plants and animals, studied the movements of stars, and debated the ideal forms of governance. The philosopher instilled in his pupil a curiosity about the natural world and the diverse cultures that inhabited distant lands. These lessons would later influence how Alexander approached his conquests, with a mind not just to rule, but to understand. The relationship between teacher and student was complex. Aristotle believed in the natural superiority of Greeks over barbarians, all non-Greek peoples. Yet Alexander would ultimately reject this view, envisioning instead a world where Greek and Persian might blend into something new. Here was the first hint that the student would one day surpass his teacher's worldview. As twilight gathered over the Macedonian hills, these philosophical discussions would often turn to questions of destiny. What makes a great king? What is the proper aim of ambition? How should one balance personal glory with responsibility to others? In the gentle hush of evening, with crickets beginning their nightly chorus, teacher and student contemplated these eternal questions beneath stars that seemed to whisper of possibilities. While Alexander's mind developed under Aristotle's tutelage, his body was honed through rigorous physical training. The prince learned to ride before he could properly walk, becoming a masterful horseman. There is perhaps no better illustration of this than the story of Bucephalus, the magnificent black stallion that none could tame until Alexander. Picture the scene: a dusty training ground in the summer heat. Courtiers and soldiers gathered to watch as a magnificent but wild horse was led into the ring. Bucephalus, Oxhead, was beautiful but deemed unrideable, rearing and throwing off all who attempted to mount him. 13-year-old Alexander observed quietly from the sidelines, noticing what others had missed. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. "I can ride this horse," the prince declared. His father, skeptical but intrigued, allowed the attempt. The gathered crowd fell silent as Alexander approached the nervous animal. Speaking in soft, soothing tones, he turned Bucephalus toward the sun so that his shadow fell behind him. Gently stroking the horse's neck, he removed his cloak with slow, deliberate movements, then, in one fluid motion, mounted the great steed. The crowd gasped, then erupted in cheers as Alexander rode Bucephalus around the training ground, the horse responding to his lightest touch. When he returned to his father, Philip's eyes shone with tears. "My son," he said, "seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." This bond between Alexander and Bucephalus would last for nearly 20 years, the great horse carrying him through battles across 3 continents. In this relationship, we glimpse Alexander's remarkable ability to connect with and lead others, whether human or animal, through observation, patience, and bold action. As Alexander approached manhood, tensions grew between him and his father. Philip was a brilliant king who had transformed Macedonia through military innovations and diplomatic cunning. He had united the fractious northern Greek regions and created the most formidable army of its time, but his personal life created complications for the succession. Philip had multiple wives, a common practice for Macedonian kings, and Alexander's position as heir became uncertain when his father married Cleopatra, a Macedonian noblewoman. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle toasted the couple, hoping they would produce a legitimate heir to the throne, implying that Alexander, born of the foreign princess Olympias, was somehow less legitimate. Imagine the banquet hall, warm with the glow of oil lamps, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and wine. Musicians played softly in the corner as guests reclined on couches. Then came those careless words, falling into a momentary lull in conversation. The hall grew silent. Alexander, his face flushed with anger and wine, rose to his feet. "What am I, then?" he demanded. "A bastard?" He hurled his drinking cup at the man who had insulted him. Philip, enraged at this breach of hospitality, lurched to his feet, drawing his sword, then collapsed, too drunk to keep his balance. Looking down at his father, Alexander spoke words that would hang in the air long after. "Look, men, here is the one preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, who cannot even cross from couch to couch." The rift between father and son widened. Alexander and his mother, Olympias, went into voluntary exile. Though eventually reconciled with Philip, these events cast shadows over the final years of Alexander's youth. They also reveal his quick temper and pride. traits that would mark both his greatest achievements and most troubling actions in years to come. Yet despite these tensions, Alexander continued to learn the art of leadership directly from his father. At 16, while Philip campaigned elsewhere, Alexander served as regent of Macedonia. At 18, he commanded the left wing of his father's army at the decisive Battle of Chaeronea against the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. It was Alexander's cavalry charge that broke the famous Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 300 warriors who had never before been defeated. Picture that battlefield at Chaeronea, the August sun beating down on the plain, dust rising from thousands of feet and hooves, the clash of bronze shields, the shimmer of spear points catching the light. And then, at the critical moment, a young prince leading a thunderous cavalry charge that would help secure Macedonian dominance over southern Greece. In these formative years, we see the pieces that would make the man. Aristotle's teachings nurturing his mind, Philip's example building his understanding of power, Olympias instilling mystic devotion and ambition, and his own experiences forging his character. The philosophical, the practical, the spiritual, and the personal, all converging in the Prince of Macedonia. As evening shadows lengthened across the hills of Pella, the young Alexander could not know the full shape of his destiny, but even then something stirred within him, a restlessness, a yearning for horizons beyond the mountains that cradled his homeland. He would gaze eastward, where the stars emerged first from the darkening sky, as if they were beckoning him toward lands unknown. And so the seeds of destiny took root in fertile soil. A brilliant mind, a commanding presence, boundless ambition, and that indefinable quality that compels others to follow, all waiting for the moment when the crown would pass, when the young prince would step into the full light of history, when Alexander would become great. As the night deepens and the constellations wheel overhead, we might imagine the young prince dreaming of glory, unaware of both the triumphs and the costs that lay ahead. The same stars that watched over his childhood would guide his journey across 3 continents, witness his meteoric rise, and eventually look down upon his all too early fall. But for now, in this moment of potential and becoming, let us leave. Young Alexander at the threshold of his destiny, the whole world waiting, unsuspecting, for his arrival on the stage of history. Let the soft rhythms of his breathing mingle with your own as we prepare to follow him into the dawn of his reign. Dawn breaks over Aegae, the ancient capital and sacred place of Macedonian kings. Golden light spills across the ceremonial grounds, where Philip II, conqueror of Greece, prepares to celebrate his daughter's wedding. The summer of 336 BCE is warm, the air fragrant with laurel and olive. Dignitaries from across the Greek world have gathered, a testament to Macedonia's newly won prominence. Amid the festive atmosphere, no one senses the shadow of fate that hovers like a falcon circling beneath the clear blue sky. Philip enters the theatre in a white cloak, walking deliberately ahead of his bodyguards, a show of confidence and trust in his Greek subjects. The crowd rises in respect. Alexander, now 20 years old, watches from nearby, his relationship with his father still complex, woven with admiration and rivalry. Then comes the moment that will alter the course of history. A bodyguard named Pausanias steps forward, draws a Celtic dagger, and plunges it between Philip's ribs. The king who unified Greece, who dreamed of conquering Persia, falls to the stone floor as his blood pools beneath him like a crimson map of the empire he would never rule. In the chaos that follows, Imagine the stillness at Alexander's center. A crystallizing of purpose, a collapsing of possibilities into a single path forward. While some panic and others scheme, he moves with decisive clarity to secure his claim to the throne. Those who might challenge him, including the newborn son of Philip's recent wife, Cleopatra, are swiftly eliminated, their deaths orchestrated by Olympias, Alexander's fiercely protective mother. Before Philip's body is cold, Alexander presents himself to the Macedonian army assembly, the ultimate source of kingly legitimacy. Standing before the weathered faces of veterans who had marched with his father and young men who would soon march with him, he speaks with a confidence beyond his years. His voice carries across the assembly ground, promising to honor his father's legacy while hinting at even greater glories to come. "Men of Macedonia," he declares, "the road my father prepared, I will walk. The unfinished symphony he composed, I will complete. And where he would have led you, I will go further still." The soldiers strike their spears against their shields. In a thunder of approval, Alexander, son of Philip, is now Alexander III, king of Macedon. The army has spoken, yet a crown, claimed, must still be secured. Throughout Greece, cities that had chafed under Philip's dominance see opportunity in his death and the ascension of his untested son. Athens and Thebes, proud city-states with ancient traditions of independence, begin stirring thoughts of rebellion. Rumors spread that Alexander himself has died, fueling open revolt. The new king responds with the speed and decisiveness that will become his hallmark. Imagine the Macedonian army on the march south, the rhythmic footfalls of the phalanx with their 5-meter sarissas spears carried upright like a moving forest of wood and metal, the cavalry on the flanks, dust rising from the column visible for miles. Alexander moves so quickly that many Greek cities learn he is alive only when his army appears at their gates. When he reaches Thebes, the most openly rebellious city, he offers terms of surrender. The proud Thebans refuse, believing their walls will protect them while a coalition of Greek cities assembles to confront the Macedonian upstart. It proves a fatal miscalculation. Picture the assault on Thebes. Autumn rain has turned the ground to mud as Macedonian siege engines breach the ancient walls. The disciplined phalanx advances in formation, while Alexander leads the elite companion cavalry in a flanking maneuver. The fighting is brutal, house to house, temple to temple. When it ends, Thebes lies broken. Alexander makes an example of the city, razing it to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. 6,000 Thebans lie dead, the survivors sold into slavery. The destruction sends a message that reverberates throughout Greece. Resistance is futile. One by one, the Greek cities renew their allegiance to the League of Corinth with Alexander as its hegemon. The young king has secured his southern flank through a calculated act of terror, a glimpse of the strategic ruthlessness that would both enable his conquests and complicate his legacy. With Greece pacified, Alexander turns his gaze eastward. Philip had planned to invade the Persian Empire, positioning himself as the avenger of past Persian aggression against Greece. Now his son would take up this mantle. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stands at the Hellespont, the narrow strait, dividing Europe from Asia. Behind him lies the world he knows, ahead the vast Persian Empire under King Darius III. Imagine this moment of crossing, the fleet of 160 triremes and numerous transport vessels cutting through the blue waters, the morning sun glinting off bronze helmets and spear points. Alexander, aboard the lead ship, performs sacrifices to Poseidon and the Nereid sea nymphs. As his vessel nears the Asian shore, he hurls his spear from the bow so that it stands quivering in the soil, symbolically claiming Asia as Spear One territory before he has conquered a single province. The first, to leap from his ship onto Asian soil, Alexander kneels to touch the earth of the continent he intends to claim. His army disembarks around him, approximately 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, a modest force compared to the vast resources of the Persian Empire. Yet what this army lacks in numbers, it makes up for in training, innovation, and leadership. The core of Alexander's infantry is the Macedonian phalanx, a formation revolutionized by Philip II. Unlike the traditional Greek phalanx 8 ranks deep, the Macedonian version can be up to 16 ranks deep, with soldiers carrying the longer sarissa. This creates a nearly impenetrable wall of spear points. Supporting the phalanx are more lightly armed troops, archers and slingers, who provide flexibility on varied terrain, but it is the cavalry that gives Alexander his decisive edge. The companion cavalry, led by the king himself, are heavily armored, shock troops capable of delivering devastating charges at crucial moments. The Thessalian cavalry, nearly as elite, provide additional mobile striking power. This combined arms approach, heavy infantry to fix enemy forces in place, cavalry to deliver the decisive blow, becomes Alexander's signature battlefield strategy. Beyond tactics, Alexander possesses an intuitive genius for the psychological dimensions of warfare. He leads from the front, sharing dangers and hardships with his men. Before battle, he walks among the troops, calling veterans by name, reminding them of past victories, inspiring the younger soldiers with visions of glory to come. His personal courage is legendary, often the first into battle, consistently in the thickest fighting, bearing scars from wounds taken in combat. This army now moves inland from the Hellespont, advancing toward the ancient city of Troy. Here, Alexander pays homage to his hero Achilles running naked around the hero's tomb, as described in ancient custom. From the temple of Athena, he takes an ancient shield said to date from the Trojan War, which he will carry into his most significant battles, symbolically connecting his campaign to the mythic past. As the Macedonian army advances deeper into Persian territory, the satraps, provincial governors, of Asia Minor gather an army to meet them at the river Granicus. Though advised to avoid battle so near to his landing, Alexander is eager to engage. Picture the scene. A May afternoon, the river swollen with spring melt, its banks steep and slippery. The Persians have positioned themselves advantageously on the eastern bank, their cavalry in front, infantry behind. Conventional wisdom would demand caution, perhaps seeking a better crossing point. But Alexander has not come to follow conventional wisdom. As the setting sun casts long shadows across the river valley, he orders an immediate attack. The Macedonian army advances toward the river with Alexander and the companion cavalry on. The right wing, the crossing begins under a hail of Persian arrows. Horses struggle against the current, men slip on the muddy banks. The first Macedonian troops to reach the opposite shore are met by fierce resistance. For a crucial moment, the battle hangs in balance. Then Alexander, recognizable by his distinctive white-plumed helmet and dazzling armor, plunges into the thickest fighting with his companions around him. In hand-to-hand combat, a Persian noble aims a sword blow at Alexander's head. The king's guard, Clytus the Black, severing the Persian's arm with his sword, saving Alexander's life, the first of several near deaths the conqueror will experience. As sunset fades to twilight, the Persian line breaks. What began as an orderly retreat becomes a rout. By nightfall, the Persian coalition lies shattered, their camp captured, over 4,000 of their forces killed, and many more taken prisoner. The Macedonian losses are minimal by comparison, perhaps 400 men in total. Imagine this moment of crossing. The fleet of 160 triremes and numerous transport vessels cutting through the blue waters, the morning sun glinting off bronze helmets and spear points. Alexander, aboard the lead ship, performs sacrifices to Poseidon and the Nereid sea nymphs. As his vessel nears the Asian shore, he hurls his spear from the bow so that it stands quivering in the soil, symbolically claiming Asia as Spear One territory before he has conquered a single province. The first to leap from his ship onto Asian soil, Alexander kneels to touch the earth of the continent he intends to claim. His army disembarks around him, approximately 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, a modest force compared to the vast resources of the Persian Empire. Yet what this army lacks in numbers, it makes up for in training, innovation, and leadership. The core of Alexander's infantry is the Macedonian phalanx, a formation revolutionized by Philip II. Unlike the traditional Greek phalanx 8 ranks deep, the Macedonian version can be up to 16 ranks deep, with soldiers carrying the longer sarissa. This creates a nearly impenetrable wall of spear points. Supporting the phalanx are more lightly armed troops, archers and slingers, who provide flexibility on varied terrain. But it is the cavalry that gives Alexander his decisive edge. The companion cavalry, led by the king himself, are heavily armored, shock troops capable of delivering devastating charges at crucial moments. The Thessalian cavalry, nearly as elite, provide additional mobile striking power. This combined arms approach, heavy infantry to fix enemy forces in place, cavalry to deliver the decisive blow, becomes Alexander's signature battlefield strategy. Beyond tactics, Alexander possesses an intuitive genius for the psychological dimensions of warfare. He leads from the front, sharing dangers and hardships with his men. Before battle, he walks among the troops, calling veterans by name, reminding them of past victories, inspiring the younger soldiers with visions of glory to come. His personal courage is legendary, often the first into battle, consistently in the thickest fighting, bearing scars from wounds taken in combat. This army now moves inland from the Hellespont, advancing toward the ancient city of Troy. Here, Alexander pays homage to his hero Achilles running naked around the hero's tomb as described in ancient custom. From the temple of Athena, he takes an ancient shield, said to date from the Trojan War, which he will carry into his most significant battles, symbolically connecting his campaign to the mythic past. As the Macedonian army advances deeper into Persian territory, the satraps, provincial governors, of Asia Minor gather an army to meet them at the river Granicus. Though advised to avoid battle so near to his landing, Alexander is eager to engage. Picture the scene: a May afternoon, the river swollen with spring melt, its banks steep and slippery. The Persians have positioned themselves advantageously on the eastern bank, their cavalry in front, infantry behind. Conventional wisdom would demand caution, perhaps seeking a better crossing point. But Alexander has not come to follow conventional wisdom. As the setting sun casts long shadows across the river valley, he orders an immediate attack. The Macedonian army advances toward the river with Alexander and the companion cavalry on the right wing. The crossing begins under a hail of Persian arrows. Horses struggle against the current, men slip on the muddy banks. The first Macedonian troops to reach the opposite shore are met by fierce resistance. For a crucial moment, the battle hangs in balance. Then Alexander, recognizable by his distinctive white-plumed helmet and dazzling armor, plunges into the thickest fighting with his companions around him. In hand-to-hand combat, a Persian noble aims a sword blow at Alexander's head. The king's guard, Clytus the Black, severing the Persian's arm with his sword, saving Alexander's life, the first of several near deaths the conqueror will experience. As sunset fades to twilight, the Persian line breaks. What began as an orderly retreat becomes a rout. By nightfall, the Persian coalition lies shattered, their camp captured, over 4,000 of their forces killed, and many more taken prisoner. The Macedonians' losses are minimal by comparison, perhaps 400 men in total. Dawn breaks over the mountains to the east, illuminating the vast Persian host with its colourful standards and varied peoples drawn from across the empire. In the centre, Darius himself commands from a magnificent war chariot, surrounded by his royal guard of 10,000 immortals. The Persian cavalry is positioned on the seaward flank, with Greek mercenary infantry forming the centre and lighter troops extending into the foothills. Alexander arranges his forces in response, placing his heavy infantry phalanx in the centre. To engage the Persian infantry with hypaspists, shield-bearers, and light infantry on the left, and himself with the companion cavalry on the right wing. As at Granicus, he plans to use the phalanx to fix the enemy centre, while delivering a decisive blow with his cavalry. The battle begins with skirmishing, followed by a rapid advance of the Macedonian line. Alexander leads his cavalry in a charge, aimed at where Darius commands. Imagine this moment, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men, the clash of metal on metal as the companion cavalry smashes into the Persian left. The fighting is intense, with Alexander himself wounded in the thigh. As the battle rages, the Persian cavalry on their left initially gains an advantage against the Macedonian right, but fails to exploit it. In the centre, the Greek mercenaries, in Persian service, put up fierce resistance against the Macedonian phalanx, creating a dangerous bulge in Alexander's line. The crucial moment comes when Alexander's cavalry charge, pushing through desperate resistance, begins to approach Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing his left flank collapsing and enemy cavalry breaking through toward his position, makes the decision that will define his legacy. He turns his chariot and flees the battlefield. Seeing their king flee, the Persian forces begin to collapse. What was an organized battle becomes a chaotic rout, with thousands trampled or killed during the retreat through narrow mountain passes. The Persian camp falls to the Macedonians, along with Darius's family, his mother, Sisygambes, his wife Statera, and his daughters. Alexander treats the captured royal family with respect and courtesy. Upon entering the royal tent, Sisygambes mistakenly prostrates herself before Hephaestion, Alexander's slightly taller companion, thinking him to be the king. When informed of her error, she is mortified, but Alexander graciously tells her, "You were not mistaken, mother. This man, too, is Alexander." This victory at Issus changes the dynamic of the campaign. Darius, in retreat toward his eastern capitals, sends Alexander a letter proposing peace. He offers all territories west of the Euphrates River, 30,000 talents of silver, an enormous sum, and the hand of his daughter in marriage. Alexander's general Parmenio famously remarks, "If I were Alexander, I would accept these terms." And, "So would I," Alexander replies, "if I were Parmenio." The king rejects the offer, stating that he already possesses all the territories and treasures Darius offers, and that if he wishes to marry Darius's daughter, he will do so without asking permission. He demands nothing less than Darius's complete submission as his subject, terms the Persian king cannot accept without surrendering his sovereignty. Rather than immediately pursuing Darius into the heart of the empire, Alexander chooses to secure the eastern Mediterranean coastline first, eliminating any potential Persian naval threat to Greece and Macedonia. This decision leads him to Phoenicia, where the ancient trading cities control the ports and fleets that give Persia its maritime power. Most Phoenician cities surrender without resistance, but Tyre, situated on an island half a mile from shore, refuses to admit Alexander. The The Tyrians believe their city impregnable, protected by high walls and the surrounding sea. Alexander, however, is not one to accept impossibilities. He orders the construction of a mole, a stone causeway extending from the mainland to the island. Work begins immediately, using materials from the abandoned mainland portion of the city. At first, progress is rapid, but as the mole extends into deeper water, difficulties multiply. The Tyrians harass the workers with missile fire from ships and the city walls. They send fire ships against the construction and succeed in destroying wooden towers erected to protect the workers. Undeterred, Alexander rebuilds the damaged sections wider than before and brings in ships from cities that have already surrendered to provide naval protection for the ongoing work. The siege stretches from January to July of 332 BCE, 7 months of determined effort against equally determined resistance. Finally, the mole reaches the island. Alexander's engineers construct massive siege engines, including battering rams mounted on ships and towers that overtop Tyre's walls. After a coordinated land and sea assault, the city walls are breached. The fighting within the city is savage, with defenders fighting street by street. When resistance finally ends, Alexander's fury at the prolonged defiance is unleashed. 8,000 Tyrians are killed in the fighting, 2,000 more crucified along the shore as an example, and the remaining 30,000 sold into slavery. The fall of Tyre, previously thought impregnable, sends shockwaves throughout the region. For Alexander, it removes the Persian naval threat and adds to his growing aura of invincibility. Only Gaza, under its commander Battis, dares to resist him on his southward march toward Egypt. This fortress city withstands a 2-month siege before falling in late 332 BCE. Alexander, wounded during the fighting, treats Gaza as harshly as he had Tyre. As autumn cools the desert air, Alexander leads his army into Egypt. After the stubborn resistance of Tyre and Gaza, the contrast is stark. Egypt surrenders without a fight. The Persian satrap, recognizing the inevitability of Alexander's victory and perhaps hoping to curry favor, hands over the treasury of 800 talents and all royal equipment. The Egyptians, long resentful of Persian rule, welcome Alexander as a liberator. In Memphis, the ancient capital, he makes sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, especially Apis, demonstrating a cultural sensitivity that helps secure Egyptian loyalty. He is crowned as pharaoh, legitimizing his rule in Egyptian eyes and connecting him to a royal tradition stretching back 3,000 years. It is here in Egypt, at the western edge of his growing empire, that Alexander undertakes one of his most enduring creations, the founding of Alexandria. On a strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean Sea, he personally outlines the city's boundaries, using barley meal to mark where the walls should stand. When birds swoop down to eat the grain, his seers interpret this as an omen, that the city will one day feed many nations. Alexandria is conceived as more than just another conquest city. It is designed as a meeting point between Greek and Egyptian cultures, a commercial hub, and a monument to Alexander himself. With its grand harbour, wide streets laid out in a grid pattern, and plans for magnificent buildings, the city embodies Alexander's vision of cultural fusion. Though he will never see it completed, Alexandria will indeed become one of the ancient world's greatest cities, a centre of learning and commerce long after his death. From Alexandria, Alexander makes a dangerous journey across the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis. This arduous trek, undertaken with a small company rather than his full army, nearly ends in disaster when sandstorms obscure the route. According to legend, 2 ravens appear to guide the lost party to the oasis. At Siwa, Alexander consults the oracle alone. What transpires between him and the priests remains largely a mystery. Some accounts claim he was acknowledged as the son of Ammon, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. Alexander himself never directly reveals what was said, but after this visit his coins begin to depict him with the ram's horns of Ammon, and rumors spread that he has begun to believe in his own divine parentage. As the desert night deepens, around Siwa, with stars burning like distant campfires in the vast black sky, Alexander perhaps contemplates how far he has already come, and how much further he intends to go. Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, Phoenicia, and now Egypt have all fallen to him. Yet the heart of the Persian Empire, with its ancient capitals of Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, remains unconquered. And somewhere in those eastern lands, Darius is gathering a new army to face him. The young king, not yet 25 years old, has achieved more in 3 years than most rulers accomplish in a lifetime. But the greatest challenges and the most fateful decisions still lie ahead, shimmering like a mirage on the eastern horizon. As sleep begins to settle over you, imagine Alexander standing at the edge of the desert, gazing up at the same constellations that have guided travelers for thousands of years. The cool night air carries the scent of distant oases, and somewhere beyond the darkness waits the heart of an empire he has vowed to claim. The journey is far from over. It has, in many ways, only just begun. Moonlight bathes the ancient stones of Egypt in silver as Alexander stands at the edge of the Nile, watching its dark waters flow northward as they have since time immemorial. The river murmurs secrets of pharaohs and gods, of civilizations rising and falling like the annual floods that give this land its fertility. Egypt has embraced him, crowned him as its own, but Alexander cannot linger here at the western edge of his conquests. The heart of the Persian Empire calls to him, its pulse beating in ancient capitals he has yet to see. Spring arrives in 331 BCE, and with it Alexander's preparations to depart Egypt. The foundations of Alexandria have been laid, though the city exists mostly as plans and dreams rather than stone and timber. He leaves behind administrators to govern this rich land in his name and turns his gaze eastward, back toward the territories he has already claimed and those that still await his coming. Returning through Palestine and Syria, Alexander crosses the Euphrates and Tigris rivers without opposition. The bridges that Darius might have destroyed are left intact, raising questions about Persian strategy. Beyond the Tigris, scouts bring word that the Persian king awaits with an enormous army assembled from the eastern satrapies of his empire. Darius has chosen his ground carefully this time, selecting a broad plain near Gaugamela, where his superior numbers can be fully utilized. Imagine the tension as Alexander approaches the decisive confrontation. His officers concerned about the vast Persian numbers, estimated at between 100,000 to 250,000 men, compared to their own force of around 47,000. The Persian army includes contingents from across the empire, Bactrian cavalry, Indian chariots, Persian immortals, skilled archers from many nations. Darius has also leveled the ground to create an ideal field for his scythed chariots, designed to slice through infantry formations. Alexander pauses 4 days before the battle, resting his troops and conducting reconnaissance. On the night before the engagement, while his generals advise attacking under cover of darkness, Alexander sleeps soundly. When Parmenio finds him still sleeping late into the morning and expresses surprise, Alexander replies, "How could I not be at ease when Darius is doing all he can to make me successful by gathering his entire empire in one place for me to defeat?" Breaks on October 1st, 331 BCE. The autumn air is cool as both armies deploy across the plain of Gaugamela. Darius has positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by his elite Persian infantry and cavalry. His flanks extend far beyond Alexander's, threatening to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. Alexander arranges his army with characteristic innovation. Expecting to be outflanked, he draws up his infantry in a defensive formation with units positioned at angles to the main line, ready to face attacks from multiple directions. He places himself with the companion cavalry on the right wing, while his trusted general Parmenio commands the left. As the sun climbs higher, bathing the plain in golden light, Alexander begins a calculated diagonal advance toward the Persian right. This oblique movement forces Darius to extend his left wing to maintain contact, creating gaps in the Persian line. The Persian king responds by launching his scythed chariots against the Macedonian phalanx, but Alexander's infantry open their ranks, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through before cutting down the drivers. The decisive moment comes when Darius, seeing Alexander's rightward drift, orders his left-wing cavalry to engage. As they move forward, a gap opens near Darius's position. Alexander, who has held the companion cavalry in check until this moment, sees his opportunity. Leading his horsemen in a tight wedge formation, he drives directly toward this gap, aiming for the Persian king himself. Picture this crucial charge: the thunder of hooves, the glint of sunlight on armor and weapons. Alexander, at the point of the wedge, driving toward the heart of the Persian force. The Persian line bends, then breaks under the pressure. Darius, seeing the companions approaching and his line collapsing, makes the same decision he made at Issus. He turns his chariot and flees. But the battle is far from over. On the Macedonian left, Parmenio faces enormous pressure from the Persian right wing. The Thessalian cavalry fights desperately to prevent a total collapse. Alexander, having broken through the center, receives Parmenio's urgent request for aid. Though tempted to pursue the fleeing Darius, he turns his cavalry around and relieves his beleaguered left wing. By late afternoon, the Persian army disintegrates into scattered groups retreating in different directions. Alexander pursues Darius through the night, hoping to capture the Persian king, but is forced to abandon the chase when his horses are exhausted. Darius escapes toward Ecbatana, leaving his chariot, shield, and bow behind, trophies that Alexander claims along with victory. The Battle of Gaugamela opens the heart of the Persian Empire to Alexander. Within weeks he enters Babylon, the greatest city in the world, its massive walls and hanging gardens standing as testaments to ancient power and wealth. Unlike Tyre or Gaza, Babylon welcomes him with open gates, its streets strewn with flowers, its people and priests lining the route as Alexander enters in a procession that rivals any triumph Rome would later stage. Imagine the sensory experience of Babylon, the towering ziggurat of Etemenanke reaching toward the sky, thought by some to be the Tower of Babel. The processional way lined with glazed blue bricks depicting lions and dragons, the scent of incense from 100 temples mixing with the aromas of the bustling markets where goods from across Asia are traded. The Euphrates flows through the heart of the city, crossed by a bridge considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. Alexander respects Babylonian traditions, participating in religious ceremonies to the god Marduk and restoring temples that had been neglected under Persian rule. He installs a Macedonian military governor but leaves the civil administration largely in local hands, a pattern he will follow throughout his conquered territories. After a month in Babylon, Alexander presses on to Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire. Here he captures the royal treasury with its enormous wealth, 50,000 talents of silver, enough to fund his campaign for years to come. The royal palace, with its intricate friezes and columns topped with bull-headed capitals, becomes his temporary residence as he consolidates control over the western portions of the empire. Yet the greatest prize still awaits: Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. To reach it, Alexander must navigate the Persian Gates, a narrow mountain pass where a Persian force under Ariobarzanes has prepared an ambush. The defenders roll boulders down onto the advancing Macedonians and rain arrows from the heights, inflicting significant casualties. Faced with this obstacle, Alexander does what he has done before when confronted with conventional impossibilities. He finds an unconventional solution. Local shepherds guide him and a select force along a treacherous mountain path that circles behind the Persian position. In a coordinated attack, Alexander descends on the defenders from behind, while the main army attacks from the front. Caught between two forces, Ariobarzanes' troops are slaughtered, and the way to Persepolis lies open. In January 330 BCE, Alexander enters Persepolis, the symbolic and ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. No city better represents Persian glory and power. The Apadana audience hall with its 72 columns stands as an architectural marvel. The grand staircase with its elaborate reliefs showing representatives of the subject nations bringing tribute tells the visual story of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Alexander allows his troops to plunder the city, accepting only the royal palaces. The wealth they find is staggering: 120,000 talents in precious metals, requiring 5,000 camels and numerous mules to transport. For the common Macedonian soldier who began the campaign as a poor farmer, the riches of Persepolis are beyond comprehension. For 4 months, Alexander remains in Persepolis, exploring its wonders while planning his next moves. Then comes one of the most controversial acts of his career: the burning of the royal palaces. Ancient sources differ on whether this was a calculated political statement or the result of a drunken revel. According to Diodorus Siculus, during a banquet where wine flowed freely, the Athenian courtesan Thais suggested that Alexander should burn the palaces as revenge for the Persian sacking of Athens 150 years earlier. Picture the scene. A warm spring night, the banquet hall illuminated by hundreds of oil lamps, music playing as dancers perform. Wine-flushed faces grow animated as Thais makes her provocative suggestion. Alexander, perhaps seeing a symbolic opportunity, or perhaps simply carried away by wine and the moment, takes up a torch and leads the revelers to the Apadana. Soon flames are leaping from building to building, the ancient cedars of Lebanon that form the roof beams feeding the inferno. By morning, the glory of Persepolis lies in ashes. Alexander, sobered, reportedly regretted the destruction, but the deed could not be undone. The burning sent a powerful message throughout the empire and to the Greek world. The old Persian order had ended, consumed in flames. A new era, Alexander's era, had begun. From the smouldering ruins of Persepolis, Alexander turns northward, pursuing Darius toward Ecbatana. The chase becomes a race against both distance and internal conspiracy, for as Alexander advances, a plot against Darius forms among his own followers. Bessus, satrap of Bactria and a relative of the king, conspires with other nobles to depose Darius and continue resistance against the Macedonians. As Alexander's advance forces approach, in July 330 BCE, the conspirators place Darius in a covered wagon and flee eastward. When Darius resists being taken further, Bessus and his conspirators stab him multiple times and leave him dying in the wagon while they escape. Alexander arrives shortly after, finding the Persian king still breathing but mortally wounded. In this poignant moment between conqueror and conquered, Alexander gives Darius water and hears his final words, supposedly a request that Alexander avenge him and a blessing for Alexander's future rule. The great king of Persia dies in the arms of the man who has taken his empire. With proper respect, Alexander sends Darius's body to Persepolis for burial in the royal tombs with full honors. He vows to punish Bessus not merely as a rival, but as a regicide who has violated the sacred bond between a king and his subjects. This act, honoring his defeated enemy while promising to avenge him, exemplifies Alexander's complex approach to conquest, blending respect for the traditions and legitimacy of those he defeats with absolute insistence on his own ultimate authority. The death of Darius marks a transition in Alexander's campaign and perhaps in his self-conception. He is no longer simply fighting against the Persian king. In many ways, he is becoming his successor. Alexander begins adopting elements of Persian royal dress and court ceremony, not replacing Macedonian customs, but creating a hybrid style that incorporates aspects of both cultures. This cultural blending meets resistance from many of his Macedonian companions, who see it as abandoning their traditions for barbarian customs. The tension between Alexander's vision of a unified empire embracing multiple cultures and his companions' more traditional Macedonian outlook will grow in the coming years, eventually leading to crisis. But for now, Alexander focuses on securing the eastern satrapies of the empire. The pursuit of Bessus takes him into Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, regions far from the Mediterranean world he knows. Here, the landscape changes dramatically. Harsh mountain ranges give way to scorching deserts, then to fertile river valleys where ancient irrigated agriculture supports prosperous cities. Imagine Alexander's army crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains, some peaks reaching over 7,000 meters. The narrow passes, thin air, and bitter cold claim many lives. Yet Alexander drives his forces forward, crossing terrain that would challenge modern armies with all their technology and support systems. His determination to capture Bessus and pacify these distant provinces reveals an ambition that extends beyond any rational strategic necessity. In Bactria, Alexander finally captures Bessus, with the help of local nobles who betray the usurper. The punishment is both symbolic and severe. Bessus's nose and ears are cut off, traditional Persian punishment for treason, and he is sent to Ecbatana for public execution. The message is clear: Alexander will not tolerate challenges to legitimate authority, even when that authority is now his own. Yet the conquest of these eastern territories proves far more difficult than Alexander's earlier campaigns. Unlike the centralized Persian heartland, Bactria and Sogdiana are regions of semi-independent strongholds and mobile populations with strong martial traditions. When one fortress falls, resistance emerges elsewhere. The campaigns in these regions stretch from 329 to 327 BCE, nearly 3 years of grinding warfare in difficult terrain against elusive enemies. During this period, Alexander employs both military force and political accommodation. He founds new cities, at least a dozen Alexandrias across the region, settling Greek veterans and local populations together. He incorporates 30,000 local youths into his army, training them in Macedonian tactics to create a military bridge between cultures. And perhaps most significantly, he marries Roxana, daughter of a powerful Bactrian nobleman, in a gesture that symbolizes his commitment to unifying Greek and barbarian into a new imperial identity. Picture the wedding ceremony in the fortress city of Samarkand. Alexander and Roxana sharing bread cut with a sword, a local marriage custom. The Macedonian officers watch with mixed emotions as their king takes a barbarian bride. Yet the political wisdom of the match is clear, helping to reconcile the Bactrian nobility to Macedonian rule while giving Alexander legitimate connections to the local power structure. These years in the East also see growing tensions within Alexander's inner circle. The cultural changes in his court, the introduction of the Persian practice of proskynesis, ritual prostration before the king, the adoption of elements of Persian royal dress, the increasing role of Persian nobles, create resentment among many Macedonians who see these as betrayals of their traditions. This tension erupts in several incidents, most notably in 328 BCE when Clitus the Black, the same man who saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, drunkenly criticizes the king at a banquet for abandoning Macedonian ways and comparing himself to gods. The argument escalates until Alexander, in a rage fueled by wine and injured pride, grabs a spear and runs Clitus through. The king's immediate remorse is profound. For 3 days, he refuses food and drink, lying in his tent, overwhelmed by grief and self-loathing. He has killed not just a critic, but a friend, a man who saved his life, a companion from his father's generation who represented the old Macedonian values. The incident reveals the dangerous volatility that sometimes lurks beneath Alexander's controlled exterior, and the genuine emotional attachment he feels to those who have shared his journey. A year later, another crisis emerges with the Pages Conspiracy. A group of royal pages led by Hermolus plot to assassinate Alexander. When the conspiracy is discovered and the plotters confess under torture, they implicate Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who serves as the expedition's official historian. Though not directly involved in the assassination plot, Callisthenes had openly criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his growing desire for divine honors. Alexander executes the conspirators and imprisons Callisthenes, who later dies in custody. This harsh response to criticism, especially from a philosopher connected to his former mentor Aristotle, suggests how far Alexander has traveled from his Greek philosophical roots. The king who once slept with Homer's Iliad beneath his pillow now seems more comfortable with Persian concepts of absolute monarchy than with Greek traditions of free speech and philosophical criticism. By 327 BCE, Alexander has largely pacified the eastern provinces, though at great cost in time and lives. He has extended his empire to the edges of the known world, or so many of his troops believe. But Alexander has heard stories of lands beyond, of the great river valleys of India, with their ancient civilizations and fabulous wealth. His ambition, seemingly without limit, now turns toward these lands beyond the mountains. As Alexander stands at the threshold between the Persian world he has conquered and the Indian subcontinent that beckons, he occupies a unique position. Between Europe and Asia, between Greek and Persian cultural traditions, between historical reality and mythic destiny, the young king who left Macedonia 7 years earlier has transformed not just the political map, but himself as well. The night deepens around us as we pause in our story. Imagine Alexander in his tent, perhaps studying maps drawn by his surveyors, or discussing the coming campaign with his generals, or sharing a private moment with Roxana. Beyond the tent walls, the campfires of his army dot the landscape like earthbound stars, each flame representing men who have followed him thousands of miles from home. The mountains loom dark against the night sky, their passes leading to India and whatever fate awaits there. For Alexander, there is never a question of turning back, only of what lies ahead, what new horizons wait to be crossed, what impossibilities remain to be conquered. As you drift towards sleep, Let the rhythm of this ancient journey carry you, like a river, flowing ever eastward toward dreams as vast as Alexander's ambitions and as boundless as his vision of a world united under his rule. As dawn breaks over the Hindu Kush mountains, pale light spills across jagged peaks still crowned with snow even in summer. The air is thin and sharp at these altitudes, carrying the scent of pine and distant glaciers. Alexander stands at the mountain pass known as the Kawak, gazing eastward toward the lands that will become Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Behind him stretches the vast empire he has already claimed. Ahead lies a world known to the Greeks largely through legends and travelers' tales, a place of marvels and monsters, wealth and mystery. The crossing into the Indian subcontinent begins in the spring of 327 BCE. Alexander's army, hardened by years of campaigning but weary from the brutal fighting in Bactria and Sogdiana, winds like a great serpent through narrow mountain passes. Supply wagons creak under their loads. Horses and mules struggle for footing on treacherous paths, while soldiers march with the mechanical rhythm developed through years of common purpose. Picture Alexander riding Bucephalus, the aging warhorse, who has carried him from Macedonia to the edge of the known world. The king's face is more weathered now than when he began his expedition, his body bearing scars from wounds taken in battle. At 30 years of age, he has spent a third of his life on this campaign of conquest. The fresh-faced prince who crossed the Hellespont has been transformed by experience, victory, and the heavy responsibility of empire. The army that follows him has transformed as well. No longer purely Macedonian and Greek, it now includes Thracians, Persians, Bactrians, and soldiers drawn from across the conquered territories. Alexander has incorporated 30,000 young men from the eastern provinces, trained in Macedonian fighting techniques, but bringing their own cultural perspectives to this multicultural force. This new model army represents Alexander's vision of a unified empire where Greek and barbarian serve together under his leadership. As the army descends from the mountains into what is now eastern Afghanistan, Alexander divides his forces. He sends Hephaestion, his closest companion since childhood, and possibly his lover, with half the army to secure the route through the Khyber Pass. Alexander himself takes the remainder on a more difficult route through the lands of fierce hill tribes who have never submitted to outside authority. These tribal regions prove among the most challenging of the entire campaign. The local warriors employ guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to the mountainous terrain, quick ambushes followed by retreat into nearly inaccessible strongholds. Unlike the conventional armies Alexander has defeated so often, these opponents refuse to meet him in open battle where his superior tactics would prevail. One of the most dramatic episodes of this phase occurs at a mountain fortress called Aornos, modern Piasar, which local tradition claimed even the mythical hero Heracles had failed to capture. Perched atop a steep plateau with sheer cliffs on all sides, the fortress seems impregnable. Yet Alexander, ever attracted to the supposedly impossible, is determined to take it. After careful reconnaissance, he discovers a ridge leading toward the plateau. His engineers construct a mound of earth and timber to bridge the remaining gap. For 3 days, the Macedonians work under constant fire from the defenders, gradually extending their approach. On the 4th day, Alexander leads an elite assault force across the makeshift bridge onto the plateau. After fierce fighting, the defenders retreat and eventually abandon the fortress under cover of night. Alexander has accomplished what even Heracles supposedly could not, another achievement to add to his growing legend. By early 326 BCE, Alexander reaches the Indus River, broad, powerful, and sacred, a liquid boundary between civilizations. Here, at the edge of the Punjab, he is welcomed by Taxiles, a local ruler who sees in the Macedonian a potential ally against his rivals, particularly King Porus, who rules the lands beyond the Hydaspes River, modern Jhelum. The friendship with Taxiles provides Alexander with valuable information about the territories ahead and a secure base from which to operate. Guided by this local knowledge, Alexander advances toward the Hydaspes, where Porus waits with a formidable army that includes something the Macedonians have rarely faced: war elephants, living siege engines capable of terrifying even seasoned troops. May of 326 BCE finds Alexander camped on the western bank of the Hydaspes, facing Porus's army on the opposite shore. The river, swollen with spring melt from the Himalayas, presents a serious obstacle. Porus vigilantly guards all the obvious crossing points, moving his forces to match Alexander's whenever the Macedonians appear to be preparing a crossing. What follows demonstrates Alexander's tactical genius at its most brilliant. For weeks, he conducts feints and false preparations at various points along the river, conditioning Porus to expect such movements as mere deceptions. Meanwhile, Alexander secretly identifies a crossing point 17 miles upstream, where a wooded bend in the river will conceal his actual crossing. On a dark night, with a thunderstorm providing cover for the sound of their movements, Alexander leads a select force of about 5,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry to this crossing point. They use hide rafts and local boats to navigate the dangerous waters. By dawn, they have established a foothold on the eastern bank, but not without complications. They discover they have landed on an island rather than the main eastern shore, requiring a second treacherous crossing through rapidly rising waters. As morning light spreads across the floodplain, Porus learns of the crossing and faces a crucial decision. He sends a force under his son to contest Alexander's advance while maintaining most of his army at the main crossing point, uncertain whether this is Alexander's main force or another feint. Alexander's cavalry quickly overcomes the smaller force sent against them. Porus, realizing this is indeed the main Macedonian attack, now marches his entire army to meet the invader. By mid-morning, the two armies face each other on an open plain suitable for the deployment of Porus's war elephants. Imagine this dramatic battlefield: the rain-soaked plain steaming in the morning sun, the Hydaspes River flowing swiftly behind, the Macedonian position, and before them the impressive array of Porus's army. At the center stand the war elephants, great grey beasts with armored howdahs on their backs containing archers and javelin throwers. Between and behind the elephants are formed Indian infantry, while cavalry protects both flanks. Alexander assesses this imposing formation with the eye of a commander who has never lost a battle. He recognizes that the elephants, concentrated in the center, pose the greatest threat to his infantry phalanx. His battle plan emerges from this analysis. He will use his superior cavalry to defeat Porus's horsemen on the flanks, then envelop the Indian infantry, leaving the elephants isolated. The battle begins with Alexander personally leading the companion cavalry against the Indian left wing. The fierce charge of the Macedonian heavy cavalry breaks the Indian horsemen after a brief but intense struggle. Meanwhile, on the other flank, Alexander's general Conus executes a brilliant flanking maneuver, sweeping behind the Indian lines to attack their right-wing cavalry from the rear. Caught between two forces, the Indian cavalry disintegrates. With both flanks collapsed, Alexander encircles the Indian infantry. Porus orders his elephant corps to charge the Macedonian phalanx, creating a moment of genuine crisis for Alexander's forces. the great beasts crash into the tight infantry formations, breaking their cohesion. Spears that have stopped Persian cavalry prove ineffective against the thick hides of the elephants. For a critical period, the battle hangs in the balance. Men are trampled beneath massive feet, impaled on tusks, or snatched by trunks and dashed to the ground. The sounds are horrific. The trumpeting of enraged elephants, the screams of wounded men, the clash of weapons, and the shouts of commanders trying to maintain order amid chaos. Alexander responds with flexibility, ordering his light infantry to target the elephant drivers and the soldiers in the howdahs. As these handlers fall, the elephants become directionless, some rampaging randomly, others returning to their own lines, causing disruption there. Eventually, the surviving elephants, exhausted and wounded, withdraw from the battle. With the elephant charge blunted and his infantry surrounded, Porus continues to fight with remarkable courage. Even as his army collapses around him, the Indian king remains on his own war elephant, directing the battle despite multiple wounds. Only when almost all his force has been killed or captured, and his own elephant begins to kneel from exhaustion, does Porus finally descend to the blood-soaked earth. When asked by Alexander's emissaries how he wishes to be treated, Porus gives his famous reply, "As a king." Alexander, impressed by his opponent's valor and dignity in defeat, not only restores Porus to his kingdom, but expands his territories. This magnanimity toward a worthy opponent exemplifies the complex character of Alexander, capable of terrible destruction against those who defy him, yet genuinely respectful of courage and nobility wherever he finds it. The victory at the Hydaspes comes at a significant cost. Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved horse who has carried him since adolescence, dies after the battle, either from wounds or simply from old age and exhaustion. Alexander founds a city at the site named Bucephala in honor of his loyal companion. The relationship between the conqueror and his horse, spanning 20 years and thousands of miles, represents one of the more touching aspects of Alexander's story, a reminder that beneath the mantle of world conqueror remained a man capable of deep attachment. After recovering from the battle, Alexander prepares to press further into India. He has heard of powerful kingdoms beyond the Ganges with armies even larger than that of Porus, including thousands of war elephants. Far from being deterred, he is fascinated by these accounts of new challenges and unknown territories. But now Alexander faces an obstacle unlike any he has encountered before: the will of his own army. After 8 years of continuous campaigning, having marched more than 11,000 miles from Macedonia, the soldiers have reached their limit. The monsoon season has begun, bringing relentless rain that rusts armor, rots supplies, and dampens spirits. Diseases spread through the camp, claiming more lives than recent battles. More significantly, the troops can see no end to Alexander's eastward push. For them, each victory only leads to another campaign. Each river crossed only reveals another river beyond. The promise of returning home with their Persian plunder grows more distant with every eastward march. At the Hyphasis River, modern Bes, the army refuses to go further. Alexander, accustomed to overcoming all resistance, finds himself powerless against this quiet mutiny. For 3 days, he remains in his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping that his soldiers will reconsider. When this fails, he makes an impassioned speech, recounting their shared achievements and pointing to the glories that await beyond the next river. The response is silence, no cheers, no striking of spears against shields, just the sound of rain pattering on leather tents and the distant rumble of thunder. Even Alexander, with all his charisma and force of will, cannot move them. Macedonia is a distant memory, and the soldiers want to enjoy their hard-won spoils rather than risk everything on endless campaigns into the unknown. Alexander finally accepts reality. Unable to advance but unwilling to simply retreat, he orders the construction of 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, monuments to the Olympian gods and to the furthest reach of his journey. These stone structures, larger than the tallest towers, will stand as markers at the edge of the known world, testimony to how far Alexander and his Macedonians have come. The decision to turn back marks a profound emotional and psychological moment for Alexander. For the first time in his adult life, he has encountered a limit he cannot overcome, a boundary he cannot cross. The man who cut the Gordian knot, who found a path around every obstacle, must now accept that some ambitions, even his, have their limits. The journey back to the west begins in late 326 BCE, but Alexander, ever creative, turns this strategic retreat into a new avenue of exploration. Rather than simply retracing his steps, he decides to follow the Indus River southward to the ocean, then return to Persia partly by sea, a route no Greek army has ever taken. This southern expedition is no easy march. As the army moves down the Indus Valley, they encounter fierce resistance from local tribes. During the assault on a city of the Mali people, Alexander nearly loses his life in an act of characteristic impetuosity. Impatient with his army's progress in breaching the city walls, he grabs a ladder and ascends alone, leaping into the city ahead of his troops. He finds himself isolated, a target for every defender, and receives a serious chest wound from an arrow that penetrates his lung. His officers, frantic at seeing their king fall, fight their way through to him and carry his bleeding form back to camp. For days, Alexander hovers between life and death, his labored breathing the only sign that the conqueror of Asia still clings to life. The army waits in a state of silent dread, knowing that Alexander's death would leave them stranded thousands of miles from home in hostile territory. Alexander gradually recovers, though the chest wound never fully heals and will trouble him for the remainder of his life. This brush with mortality seems to sober him, perhaps making him aware of his own human limitations, even as his legend grows to mythic proportions. By the summer of 325 BCE, Alexander reaches the delta of the Indus, where it empties into the Arabian Sea. Here, on the shore of an ocean his Macedonians have never seen before, he makes sacrifices to Poseidon and the other gods, symbolically claiming even the sea for his empire. He divides his forces. The main army under his general Craterus will take an inland route back toward Persia, while Alexander himself will lead another portion along the coastal regions of modern Pakistan and Iran. A third group will travel by sea under his admiral Nearchus, keeping contact with the coastal column. The march through Gedrosia, modern Baluchistan, becomes the most devastating experience of the entire campaign. This coastal desert, with temperatures regularly exceeding 120 degrees (49 degrees), has almost no sources of fresh water or food. Alexander had expected to resupply from Nearchus's ships, but storms forced the fleet to remain far offshore, out of contact with the land forces. For 60 days, the army struggles through this hellscape of sand and rock. Men and animals collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Supply wagons are abandoned when the draft animals die. Alexander famously pours out water brought to him into the sand, refusing to drink when his soldiers cannot. But such gestures, however noble, cannot prevent the mounting losses. By the time they reach the Persian province of Carmania, perhaps 2/3 of those who entered Gedrosia have perished, not from enemy action, but from the implacable hostility of the environment itself. This march claims more Macedonian lives than all of Alexander's battles combined, a sobering reminder of the limits of human endurance and the consequences of pushing beyond reasonable boundaries. The remnants of the army that struggle out of the desert in late 325 BCE are shadows of the conquering force that entered India. Their clothes hang in tatters, their skin burned and blistered, their bodies gaunt from hunger. Yet they have accomplished what many thought impossible. They have marched to the edge of the known world and returned. Eventually, Alexander reunites all three columns of his army at Susa in early 304 BCE. He has been absent from the heart of his empire for nearly 5 years, and much has changed in that time. Reports of corruption and abuse of power by his satraps reach him from all directions. Some governors have ruled as if Alexander would never return, enriching themselves and oppressing the local populations. Alexander responds with characteristic severity, executing several officials for corruption. He wants an empire based on legitimate authority and relative justice, not mere exploitation. This rigorous house-cleaning sends a message throughout the empire. The king is back, and he is watching. At Susa, Alexander takes another bold step in his vision of cultural fusion, arranging a mass wedding where 80 of his officers and 10,000 of his soldiers marry Persian women. Alexander himself takes 2 additional wives, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of a previous Persian king, despite already being married to Roxana. These multiple marriages accord with Persian royal tradition, though they conflict with Macedonian practice. Picture this extraordinary ceremony, thousands of couples joining hands in the Persian fashion, Greek and Macedonian soldiers alongside, Persian noblewomen, Alexander blessing each union. For 5 days the celebrations continue with music, dancing and feasting that blends Greek and Persian elements. This mass wedding represents Alexander's most dramatic attempt to create a new culture, combining elements from across his vast empire. Yet this vision meets significant resistance from many of his Macedonian veterans, who see these Persian marriages and the adoption of Persian court customs as betrayals of their own culture. The tension between Alexander's grand vision of a unified multicultural empire and the more traditional outlook of many of his original companions creates an increasingly fractious atmosphere. This tension erupts dramatically at Opis in 324 BCE, when Alexander announces plans to discharge veterans and send them home to Macedonia with generous rewards. Rather than gratitude, this announcement triggers a near mutiny. The soldiers, suspecting Alexander plans to move his capital permanently to Babylon and rely increasingly on his new Persian troops, openly express their resentment of his orientalizing tendencies. Alexander responds with rage and hurt. He remands the ringleaders for execution and withdraws to his tent, refusing to see any Macedonians for 3 days. During this time, he dines exclusively with Persian nobles and promotes several Persians to positions previously reserved for Macedonians. The message is clear: he can rule without his troublesome countrymen if necessary. The standoff ends with mutual reconciliation. The Macedonian soldiers, realizing they have pushed their king too far, beg forgiveness. Alexander, understanding that his original companions remain the foundation of his power, relents. A great feast of reconciliation follows, with Alexander praying for harmony and brotherhood between all peoples of his empire. This episode reveals the fundamental tension within Alexander's imperial project. The gap between his vision of a new, unified world and the practical realities of deep-seated cultural differences. Alexander may dream of transcending the divisions between Greek and barbarian, but most of his followers remain firmly embedded in their traditional perspectives. As 324 BCE draws to a close, Alexander returns to Babylon, which he intends to make his imperial capital. The city's central location between east and west makes it ideal for administering the vast territories he has claimed. He begins ambitious construction projects and plans for future campaigns, perhaps against Arabia, North Africa, or even the Western Mediterranean. Alexander's restless ambition seems undiminished, despite all he has already achieved. Yet those who observe him closely note changes. He has become more suspicious, more prone to violent anger, more susceptible to flattery. The wound in his chest from the Malian arrow never fully healed, and he suffers from other injuries accumulated over years of hard campaigning. Some accounts suggest he drinks more heavily than before, perhaps to manage pain, or perhaps as an outlet for the tensions of ruling an empire stretching from the Adriatic to the Indus. As night deepens around us, we leave Alexander in Babylon, the city where Hammurabi created his famous code, where Nebuchadnezzar built his hanging gardens, where countless kings and conquerors have come and gone before him. The Euphrates flows silently past massive walls and ziggurats silhouetted against the star-filled sky. In his palace, perhaps Alexander studies maps of Arabia, planning his next conquest, or perhaps he simply watches the stars wheel overhead, wondering what fate the gods have written for him. He has reached and returned from the edge of the known world, overcoming almost every obstacle placed in his path. Yet the greatest challenge may be the one he now faces: how to hold together the vast, diverse empire he has assembled, how to transform conquest into stable rule, how to reconcile the competing visions of what his new world should be. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the lamps burning low in Alexander's chamber, casting long shadows across walls decorated with scenes from his victories. The conqueror of the world sits alone with his thoughts, perhaps contemplating the price of ambition or dreaming of new horizons yet to be reached. The man who sought to outshine the heroes of myth must now face the more mundane but equally challenging task of ruling what he has won. Monsoon rains drum against the sides of the royal tent, creating a rhythmic symphony that ebbs and flows like distant battles. Outside, the Hydaspes River has swollen beyond its banks, transforming the Punjab landscape into a glistening mirror that reflects the brooding sky. Alexander stands at the entrance to his tent, watching water drip from the canvas awning, each droplet a tiny ephemeral world catching the subdued light before falling to join the saturated earth below. The victory over King Porus has opened the doorway to deeper India, but nature itself seems to conspire against further advance. For nearly 2 months, the rain has fallen without cease, turning roads to muddy streams and fields to shallow lakes. In this altered landscape, the Macedonian army waits, their armor developing a patina of rust despite constant attention, their spirits dampening like their sodden clothing. Alexander, ever restless, uses this enforced pause to learn about the lands that lie ahead. He summons scholars and merchants familiar with the region, questioning them extensively about the kingdoms beyond the next river. Their answers ignite his imagination, tales of the powerful Nanda Empire in the Ganges Valley, with its capital at Pataliputra, said to field armies of 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and most impressively, 6,000 war elephants. After the difficult victory over Porus with his mere 200 elephants, these numbers give even Alexander reason for reflection. Yet larger than any military challenge is the sheer scale of the subcontinent that stretches before him. India seems without end. Each river crossed only reveals another river beyond. Each kingdom conquered only brings reports of larger kingdoms further east. The land itself becomes an adversary more formidable than any human army, its vastness defying even Alexander's limitless ambition. As the monsoon finally begins to relent in late summer of 326 BCE, Alexander orders preparations for continuing eastward. The army has incorporated elements of Porus's forces, including elephants now trained to fight for, rather than against, the Macedonians. New boats have been constructed for crossing the next major river, the Assassines, modern Chenab, known for its treacherous currents. The crossing proves as dangerous as local guides had warned. Imagine the scene, the broad river flowing with awesome power, swift currents creating whirlpools capable of swallowing horses and men. The boats, though designed with the river's challenges in mind, struggle against the powerful flow. Many are dashed against rocks or capsized in the churning waters. Soldiers who fall overboard find themselves swept downstream, their heavy armor becoming death weights pulling them under. Even Alexander's vessel briefly becomes trapped in a whirlpool before skilled oarsmen manage to break free. Despite these difficulties, the army reaches the eastern bank with acceptable losses and continues their advance. They cross the Hydriotes, modern Ravi, with less difficulty, defeating small tribal forces that attempt to block their path. Each step takes them deeper into the subcontinent, further from anything familiar to Greek or Macedonian experience. The landscape transforms as they move eastward, the relatively drier Punjab giving way to more lush, tropical environments. Massive banyan trees create natural cathedrals with their spreading canopies and hanging aerial roots. Bamboo grows in dense thickets, providing material for local construction but presenting obstacles to military movement. The air becomes more humid, filled with unfamiliar scents and the calls of birds never before encountered by Western ears. Alexander's chroniclers record their amazement at the creatures they encounter. Elephants, of course, but also brilliantly colored birds, monkeys that leap through the forest canopy, and snakes of alarming size. They note with particular dread the presence of leeches in wetlands and tiny flies whose bites cause painful swelling. Disease becomes an ever-present concern, with unfamiliar fevers claiming soldiers who have survived years of combat unscathed. As the army approaches the Hyphasis River, modern Bees, word comes of powerful kingdoms that lie beyond. First, the land of the Gangaridai, and beyond that, the mighty Nanda Empire. Increasingly, Alexander's men question the purpose of continuing eastward. They have already conquered more territory than any Greek army before them. They have defeated the great king of Persia and claimed his empire. They have crossed mountains and deserts, fought in blistering heat and freezing cold. What more is there to prove? Alexander, however, remains fixed on pushing the boundaries of the known world. Perhaps he is driven by genuine curiosity about what lies beyond, perhaps by competition with mythical heroes like Dionysus and Heracles, who were said to have reached India, or perhaps by a psychological inability to accept any limitation to his will. Whatever the motivation, he orders preparations for crossing the Hyphasis and confronting whatever lies beyond. It is here that the army finally balks. Picture a camp meeting where the mood is somber despite recent victories. Veterans gather in small groups, speaking in low voices about homes unseen for nearly a decade, about plunder already won that might never be enjoyed if they continue this endless eastward march. Alexander's officers, sensing the dangerous downturn in morale, approach him with their concerns. Conus, one of his most trusted generals, becomes spokesman for the army's exhaustion. Sir, if there is one thing success has given you beyond these, ability to overcome your enemies, it is the wisdom to recognize when enough is enough. Look at your men, those who still stand before you. Their bodies are lacerated with wounds taken for you, their armor worn thin, their weapons dulled. Many began this journey with sturdy shields that have been splintered. and replaced again.
And again, we are not the same army that left Macedonia. We are not even the same men who conquered Persia.
We have given you everything a king could ask of his soldiers. We have followed you across the known world and beyond. But now we have reached our limit, not of courage, but of mortal endurance. We hunger not for more glory or gold, but for the sight of our homeland, our parents while they still live, our wives and children. Let us return with what we have already won, and let that be enough, for it is more than any king before you has achieved. Alexander listens in uncharacteristic silence, his face revealing little of his inner thoughts. He dismisses the assembly without response and withdraws to his tent, refusing meals and company for 2 days. Perhaps he is calculating whether he might continue with just his elite units, or whether Persian and Indian troops might replace his reluctant Macedonians. Perhaps he is simply struggling with the first insurmountable obstacle he has encountered, not a river or mountain or enemy army, but the human limitations of his own forces. On the 3rd day, Alexander emerges and calls the army to assembly. The soldiers gather with apprehension, uncertain whether they face their leader's legendary rage or his equally renowned capacity for strategic reassessment. Alexander looks out over the weathered faces of men who have followed him from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Ganges Valley and makes his decision. The gods have spoken through signs and omens, he announces, though many suspect these. Divine messages conveniently align with practical necessity. We shall mark this place as the eastern boundary of our journey. The relief among the troops is palpable. Alexander, unwilling to appear defeated even by circumstance, transforms this strategic retreat into a ceremonial culmination. He orders the construction of 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, monuments to the 12 Olympian gods and markers of the furthest reach of his expedition. These towers, built of stone and standing higher than the tallest city walls, will remain as testimony to how far the Macedonian army has come. Yet even as he accepts the boundary imposed by his army's endurance, Alexander's restless spirit seeks new challenges. If he cannot go further east, he will go south, following the river systems of the Punjab to the great ocean that he knows must lie beyond. This journey, never before undertaken by a Greek army, offers new territories to claim and new glories to win while still honoring the army's desire to begin the long journey homeward. The descent along the river network begins in autumn of 326 BCE. Alexander divides his forces into 3 components, one traveling by land along the western bank, another along the eastern bank, while a newly constructed fleet of some 800 vessels carries a 3rd contingent along the river itself. This river journey is both practical, allowing for easier transport of heavy equipment, and symbolic, representing the Greek desire to connect unknown waters to the familiar seas of their
homeland.
Alexander, however, remains fixed on pushing the boundaries of the known world. Perhaps he is driven by genuine curiosity about what lies beyond, perhaps by competition with mythical heroes like Dionysus and Heracles, who were said to have reached India, or perhaps by a psychological inability to accept any limitation to his will. Whatever the motivation, he orders preparations for crossing the Hyphasis and confronting whatever lies beyond. It is here that the army finally balks. Picture a camp meeting where the mood is somber despite recent victories. Veterans gather in, small groups speaking in low voices about homes unseen for nearly a decade, about plunder already won that might never be enjoyed if they continue this endless eastward march. Alexander's officers, sensing the dangerous downturn in morale, approach him with their concerns. Conus, one of his most trusted generals, becomes spokesman for the army's exhaustion. Sir, if there is one thing success has given you beyond the ability to overcome your enemies, it is the wisdom to recognize when enough is enough. Look at your men. those who still stand before you. Their bodies are lacerated with wounds taken for you, their armor worn thin, their weapons dulled. Many began this journey with sturdy shields that have been splintered and replaced again.
And again, we are not the same army that left Macedonia. We are not even the same men who conquered Persia.
We have given you everything a king could ask of his soldiers. We have followed you across the known world and beyond. But now we have reached our limit, not of courage, but of mortal endurance. We hunger not for more glory or gold, but for sight of our homeland, our parents while they still live, our wives and children. Let us return with what we have already won, and let that be enough. For it is more than any king before you has achieved. Alexander listens in uncharacteristic silence, his face revealing little of his inner thoughts. He dismisses the assembly without response and withdraws to his tent, refusing meals and company for 2 days. Perhaps he is calculating whether he might continue with just his elite units, or whether Persian and Indian troops might replace his reluctant Macedonians. Perhaps he is simply struggling with the first insurmountable obstacle he has encountered, not a river or mountain or enemy army, but the human limitations of his own forces. On the 3rd day, Alexander emerges and calls the army to assembly. The soldiers gather with apprehension, uncertain whether they face their leader's legendary rage or his equally renowned capacity for strategic reassessment. Alexander looks out over the weathered faces of men who have followed him from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Ganges Valley and makes his decision. The gods have spoken through signs and omens, he announces, though many suspect these. Divine messages conveniently align with practical necessity. We shall mark this place as the eastern boundary of our journey. The relief among the troops is palpable. Alexander, unwilling to appear defeated even by circumstance, transforms this strategic retreat into a ceremonial culmination. He orders the construction of 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, monuments to the 12 Olympian gods and markers of the furthest reach of his expedition. These towers, built of stone and standing higher than the tallest city walls, will remain as testimony to how far the Macedonian army has come. Yet even as he accepts the boundary imposed by his army's endurance, Alexander's restless spirit seeks new challenges. If he cannot go further east, he will go south, following the river systems of the Punjab to the great ocean that he knows must lie beyond. This journey, never before undertaken by a Greek army, offers new territories to claim and new glories to win while still honoring the army's desire to begin the long journey homeward. The descent along the river network begins in autumn of 326 BCE. Alexander divides his forces into 3 components, one traveling by land along the western bank, another along the eastern bank, while a newly constructed fleet of some 800 vessels carries a 3rd contingent along the river itself. This river journey is both practical, allowing for easier transport of heavy equipment, and symbolic, representing the Greek desire to connect unknown waters to the familiar seas of their
homeland.
Alexander's decision to take the Gedrosian route rather than the easier inland path likely stems from a desire to explore territory that even the Persian kings had never traversed. Historians, since antiquity, have questioned the wisdom of this choice, which subjected his army to some of the harshest conditions on earth without clear strategic benefit. Perhaps Alexander, having been forced to accept one limitation at the Hyphasis, was psychologically driven to prove that other boundaries could still be overcome. Whatever the motivation, the consequences are devastating. The coastal desert of Gedrosia offers almost no sources of fresh water, minimal vegetation for fodder, and temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees Celsius, Saudi 49 degrees C. Alexander had expected Nearchus's fleet to sail close to shore, providing supplies and water at regular intervals, but seasonal winds forced the ships to remain far offshore, out of contact with the land column. For 60 days, Alexander's army struggles through this hellscape of sand and rock. Those who know desert survival fare somewhat better: the guides, some Persian units, and troops recruited in arid regions. The Macedonians, with no experience of such environments, suffer terribly. Men collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration, often wandering from the main column in confused delirium before dying alone among the dunes. Supply wagons are abandoned when the draft animals die. The limited water they do find must be prioritized for human consumption, leaving horses and other animals to perish of thirst. The army's route becomes marked by a trail of bleached bones and abandoned equipment stretching across the desert. Alexander demonstrates both leadership and compassion during this ordeal. When scouts locate a small spring, they fill a helmet with precious water and bring it to their king. Alexander, visible to the entire army, pours the water into the sand rather than drink while his men go thirsty. The gesture, though it cannot prevent the mounting casualties, reinforces the bond between the king and those who follow him into hardship. By the time they reach the Persian province of Carmania in December 325 BCE, the Gedrosian desert has claimed more Macedonian lives than all of Alexander's battles combined. Perhaps 2/3 of those who entered the desert have perished, not from enemy action, but from the implacable hostility of the environment itself. This march, more than any military defeat, teaches Alexander the hard lesson that some ambitions carry costs too high, even for the greatest of conquerors. The remnants of the army that struggle out of the desert are shadows of the conquering force that entered India. Their clothes hang in tatters, their skin burned and blistered, their bodies gaunt from hunger. Yet they have accomplished what many thought impossible. They have marched to the edge of the known world and returned. In Carmania, Alexander reunites with Craterus's inland column and eventually with Nearchus's fleet, which has completed its own challenging journey along the coast. The sea expedition has surveyed previously uncharted coastlines and established potential sites for future ports and colonies, valuable intelligence for Alexander's vision of expanded maritime trade within his empire. These reunions are marked by celebrations that ancient sources describe in varying terms, some portraying dignified religious ceremonies, and others depicting Dionysian revelry, with Alexander riding in a chariot decorated as a drinking party. Whatever the actual nature of these events, they mark the successful, if costly, completion of the Indian campaign and the formal beginning of the return to the heart of the empire. As the army continues westward into Persia proper, Alexander confronts another challenge: reports of corruption and abuse of power by many of the satraps, governors, he left in charge during his 5-year absence in the east. Some have ruled as if Alexander would never return, enriching themselves, oppressing local populations, and in some cases preparing for potential independence should news of Alexander's death reach them. Alexander responds with characteristic severity, executing several officials for corruption or disloyalty. This purge sends a message throughout the empire: the king has returned, his authority remains absolute, and those who have abused their positions will face consequences. Yet these enforcement actions also reveal the inherent difficulty of administering such a vast empire with limited communication and oversight capabilities. As we leave Alexander on his westward journey back toward Babylon and Susa, the core of his empire, we might reflect on what the Indian campaign reveals about the conqueror and his vision. In India, Alexander encountered limits that even his willpower could not overcome. The physical endurance of his army, the sheer scale of the subcontinent, and ultimately the harsh realities of the natural world. Yet even in accepting these boundaries, he sought new paths forward, new ways to achieve glory and extend his reach. The rivers of India, the Hydaspes, Assassines, Hydraeotes, Hyphasis, and finally the mighty Indus, served as both pathways and barriers in Alexander's journey. They shaped his campaigns, challenged his armies, and ultimately carried him to the great ocean that marked the edge of the known world. Like these flowing waters, Alexander's ambition remained in constant motion, always seeking new channels. When confronted with obstacles, always moving towards some greater destination just beyond the horizon. As your consciousness drifts like a boat on gentle currents, imagine Alexander standing on the deck of his vessel as it sails westward along the Persian Gulf. His gaze shifts between the coastline passing to port and the open waters to starboard. Behind him lies India with its wonders and terrors, its victories and sacrifices. Ahead lies the heart of his empire and decisions about how to consolidate and govern the vast territories he has claimed. The evening star appears above the western horizon, a bright point in the deepening blue. Perhaps Alexander sees it as a beacon guiding him homeward, or perhaps as a reminder of how even the brightest light must eventually set. The rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull creates a soothing cadence, like the heartbeat of the world itself, constant yet ever-changing, powerful yet ultimately beyond the control of even the greatest of kings. The towering walls of Babylon rise like a mountain range crafted by human hands, their sun-baked bricks glowing amber in the late afternoon light. The Euphrates flows languidly past this ancient city, its waters carrying the whispers of civilizations that flourished and faded long before Alexander drew his first breath. Now, in the spring of 323 BCE, the 32-year-old conqueror of the known world returns to this city that he intends to make the capital of his vast empire. Alexander approaches along the processional way, his entourage dwarfed by the massive walls and the towering Ishtar Gate with its glazed blue bricks featuring bulls and dragons in relief. Unlike his first entry into Babylon 7 years earlier, when he came as a conqueror claiming the Persian Empire, he now returns as the established ruler, the legitimate king of many lands, greeted by officials he himself appointed. Yet despite the superficial similarities, much has changed since that first triumphant arrival. The young king who conquered Persia has been transformed by his experiences in the Far East. His body bears the marks of numerous wounds, most significantly the chest injury from the Malian arrow that never fully healed. His breathing is sometimes labored, particularly in the heat. His face, once smoothly handsome, now shows the weathering of years spent in harsh climates and the strain of constant campaigning. Beyond these physical changes, those close to Alexander note subtle shifts in his temperament. His legendary impatience has intensified, his anger flares more quickly, and his suspicion of potential threats has deepened. Some attribute these changes to his injuries, others to the increasingly absolutist conception of his own authority, and still others to the psychological impact of reaching the limits of conquest at the Hyphasis River. Despite these changes, Alexander's vision and ambition remain undiminished. Upon reaching Babylon, he immediately begins planning for the future of his empire. Engineers and architects are commissioned to undertake massive construction projects, the restoration of Babylon's ancient ziggurats, improvements to irrigation, systems and plans for new cities and ports. Alexander pays particular attention to the maintenance and expansion of the royal road system that connects the far-flung parts of his realm. Effective communication remains one of the greatest challenges to administering such a vast territory, and improved roads will facilitate the movement of officials, military forces, and the royal postal system established on the Persian model. Beyond infrastructure, Alexander continues his policies of cultural fusion. At Susa, several months earlier, he had arranged a mass wedding where 80 of his officers and 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian women. Alexander himself took 2 additional wives, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of a previous Persian king, despite already being married to Roxana, who was then pregnant with his child. These Persian marriages reflect Alexander's vision of creating a new elite that blends Macedonian, Greek, and Persian elements. Yet this vision meets significant resistance from many of his Macedonian veterans, who see these Persian marriages and the adoption of Persian court customs as betrayals of their own culture. The tension between Alexander's grand vision of a unified multicultural empire and the more traditional outlook of many of his original companions creates an increasingly fractious atmosphere. The towering walls of Babylon rise like a mountain range crafted by human hands, their sun-baked bricks glowing amber in the late afternoon light. The Euphrates flows languidly past this ancient city, its waters carrying the whispers of civilizations that flourished and faded long before Alexander drew his first breath. Now, in the spring of 323 BCE, the 32-year-old conqueror of the known world returns to this city that he intends to make the capital of his vast empire. Alexander approaches along the processional way, his entourage dwarfed by the massive walls and the towering Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks featuring bulls and dragons in relief. Unlike his first entry into Babylon 7 years earlier, when he came as a conqueror claiming the Persian Empire, he now returns as the established ruler, the legitimate king of many lands, greeted by officials he himself appointed. Yet despite the superficial similarities, much has changed since that first triumphant arrival. The young king who conquered Persia has been transformed by his experiences in the Far East. His body bears the marks of numerous wounds, most significantly the chest injury from the Malian arrow that never fully healed. His breathing is sometimes labored, particularly in the heat. His face, once smoothly handsome, now shows the weathering of years spent in harsh climates and the strain of constant campaigning. Beyond these physical changes, those close to Alexander note subtle shifts in his temperament. His legendary impatience has intensified, his anger flares more quickly, and his suspicion of potential threats has deepened. Some attribute these changes to his injuries, others to the increasingly absolutist conception of his own authority, and still others to the psychological impact of reaching the limits of conquest at the Hyphasis River. Despite these changes, Alexander's vision and ambition remain undiminished. Upon reaching Babylon, he immediately begins planning for the future of his empire. Engineers and architects are commissioned to undertake massive construction projects, the restoration of Babylon's ancient ziggurats, improvements to irrigation, systems and plans for new cities and ports. Alexander pays particular attention to the maintenance and expansion of the royal road system that connects the far-flung parts of his realm. Effective communication remains one of the greatest challenges to administering such a vast territory, and improved roads will facilitate the movement of officials, military forces, and the royal postal system established on the Persian model. Beyond infrastructure, Alexander continues his policies of cultural fusion. At Susa, several months earlier, he had arranged a mass wedding where 80 of his officers and 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian women. Alexander himself took 2 additional wives, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of a previous Persian king, despite already being married to Roxana, who was then pregnant with his child. These Persian marriages reflect Alexander's vision of creating a new elite that blends Macedonian, Greek, and Persian elements. Yet this vision meets significant resistance from many of his Macedonian veterans, who see these Persian marriages and the adoption of Persian court customs as betrayals of their own culture. The tension between Alexander's grand vision of a unified multicultural empire and the more traditional outlook of many of his original companions creates an increasingly fractious atmosphere. During these months in Babylon, Alexander also faces personal transitions. News arrives that Roxana has given birth to a son, Alexander IV, ensuring the continuation of his bloodline. Yet this joyful event is balanced by personal loss. His closest friend and possible lover, Hephaestion, falls ill with a fever and dies despite all efforts to save him. Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death is profound and public. He fasts for days, shaves his head in mourning, and orders that the sacred flames in temples throughout Babylon be extinguished, an honor normally reserved for the death of a great king. He crucifies the physician who had attended Hephaestion, blaming him for negligence, and orders the construction of an enormous funeral pyre and memorial that will cost an estimated 10,000 talents, a sum that could support an army for years. This excessive response to personal loss reveals how isolated Alexander has become, despite being surrounded by thousands. Hephaestion was the last person with whom he shared a connection dating back to his youth, the last one who knew him simply as Alexander rather than as king and conqueror. With Hephaestion gone, something of Alexander's own humanity seems diminished, leaving more room for the semi-divine persona he has cultivated. In late May or early June of 393 BCE, Alexander attends a banquet hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa. The evening is warm, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and incense. Wine flows freely as Alexander and his companions recline on couches, enjoying the entertainment and conversation that extends late into the night. As Alexander raises a cup, he suddenly gasps as if struck by an arrow, clutching his side in pain. The king is carried to his quarters, but the pain only intensifies. Over the next 11 days, Alexander's condition steadily deteriorates. He develops a high fever, his breathing becomes increasingly labored, and he gradually loses the ability to speak clearly. The royal physicians try various treatments: cool baths to reduce the fever, herbal preparations to ease pain, prayers and sacrifices to every deity who might intervene, but nothing arrests the mysterious illness. As word of Alexander's condition spreads through Babylon, a pall falls over the city. Soldiers and citizens alike gather outside the royal palace, maintaining a vigil day and night. Inside, Alexander's generals and companions take turns at his bedside, witnessing the rapid decline of the man who had seemed almost superhuman in his vitality and endurance. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander's breathing becomes increasingly shallow. Those at his bedside lean closer, straining to hear if he names a successor, but no clear statement comes. According to some accounts, when asked to whom he leaves his kingdom, he whispers, "To the strongest," or perhaps to Craterus, his absent general, though others claim his final statement is simply, "After me there will be a great funeral contest." As the day wanes toward evening, Alexander's breathing finally ceases. The conqueror of the known world, the man who had never lost a battle, succumbs at last to an enemy he cannot defeat. At the age of 32 years and 8 months, Alexander the Great dies in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, bringing to a close one of history's most remarkable chapters. The exact cause of Alexander's death remains one of history's great mysteries. Ancient sources describe symptoms consistent with several possible conditions: typhoid fever, malaria, pancreatitis, or perhaps poisoning. Some modern scholars suggest that his previous wound to the chest may have created complications that eventually proved fatal. Others point to his heavy drinking in his final years as contributing to liver failure or other conditions. Adding to the mystery is the report that Alexander's body did not show immediate signs of decomposition despite the summer heat of Babylon, a phenomenon interpreted by some contemporaries as evidence of his divine nature. More likely, if this account is accurate, Alexander may have suffered from a condition that mimicked death while his vital signs continued at an imperceptible level. Whatever the medical reality, the political consequences of Alexander's death are immediate and far-reaching. With no clear succession plan and only an infant son by Roxana and another yet unborn by Statera, the vast empire lacks a designated leader capable of maintaining unity. The senior generals, men like Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Antigonus, gather to determine what happens next. Their initial agreement creates a nominal power-sharing arrangement. Alexander's half-brother Philip Aridaeus, who has an intellectual disability, is proclaimed king alongside the infant Alexander IV, with various generals serving as regents and controlling different territories. This compromise quickly reveals itself as unworkable, as each general seeks to secure his own position and expand his power. Within a year of Alexander's death, the first armed conflicts erupt between his successors. These wars of the Diadochi successors will continue for nearly 50 years, gradually dismembering the empire Alexander created. Eventually, 3 major kingdoms emerge from the conflicts: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia, each ruled by a dynasty founded by one of Alexander's generals. The dream of a unified empire encompassing the known world dies with Alexander, yet his legacy lives on in other ways. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerge from the fragmentation of his empire continue the cultural blending he initiated. Greek language, literature, architecture, and philosophy spread throughout the former Persian territories, creating a common cultural framework that persists for centuries. The cities Alexander founded, at least 20 bearing his name, become centers of commerce and culture. Alexandria in Egypt, the most famous of these foundations, grows into the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, with its legendary library and museum drawing scholars from across the known world. Other Alexandrias, from modern Afghanistan to Turkey, serve as enduring outposts of Hellenistic civilization in formerly Persian territories. Beyond these tangible legacies, Alexander transforms the imagination of those who come after him. For the Romans who later conquer the Mediterranean world, he becomes both inspiration and challenge, the standard against which ambitious generals like Pompey and Caesar measure themselves. For Eastern peoples, he enters mythology as Iskander, a figure of legendary wisdom and power. In medieval European and Islamic literature, he features as the archetypal world-conquering king, his exploits embellished with each retelling. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander forever alters how rulers conceive their relationship to the larger world. His vision of empire transcends the traditional model of dominant center and subjugated periphery, suggesting instead the possibility of a world unified through cultural exchange and common governance. Though his personal empire fractures after his death, the ideal of universal rule persists, inspiring imperial projects from Rome to Byzantium to the modern era. In the end, Alexander's life reads as a study in magnificent contradictions. The Shita, student of Aristotle who rejected his teacher's ethnocentrism, the commander who shared every hardship with his men yet executed those who questioned his judgment, the conqueror who destroyed Thebes and Persepolis yet showed respect and magnanimity to worthy opponents like Porus, the visionary who dreamed of uniting the world yet unleashed decades of war through his failure to establish a clear succession. As night deepens around us, we might imagine the funeral procession that carried Alexander's body. Not to Macedonia, as he might have expected, but to Egypt, where Ptolemy claimed the corpse as legitimizing his rule. A magnificent golden funeral. Carriage bore the conqueror's remains drawn by 64 mules specially selected and trained for the honor. The sarcophagus, itself a masterpiece of craftsmanship, was later housed in Alexandria, where it remained a site of pilgrimage for centuries. In time, even Alexander's tomb was lost to history, a fitting metaphor perhaps for how his physical presence faded while his legend grew. The man who sought to reach the ends of the earth and dreamed of conquering unknown worlds beyond became himself a kind of mythic territory mapped and remapped by successive generations who found in his story reflections of their own ambitions, virtues, and flaws. The stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that guided Alexander's journeys across 3 continents. The rivers he crossed, the Granicus, the Euphrates, the Indus, continue their eternal flow to the sea. The deserts he traversed still shift their sands under the hot sun, and the mountain passes he conquered still wind through peaks that stand as silent witnesses to the passage of armies and empires. Alexander's mortal frame returned to the elements long ago, but the ripples of his passage through history continue to spread outward through time, touching shores he never could have imagined. The young king from Macedonia who dreamed of outshining the heroes of myth achieved exactly that, becoming not just a conqueror of nations, but a conqueror of imagination, a presence that continues to inspire and trouble us thousands of years after his brief but incandescent life. And so our story comes to its close, though Alexander's influence never truly ends.
As sleep begins to embrace you, perhaps you carry with you some fragment of this ancient tale, the ambition that drove a young king to the edges of the known world, the vision that sought to unite East and West, the human fragility that limited
Even history's most successful conqueror. In dreams, perhaps you too will cross distant rivers and scale impossible mountains, following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. If insomnia is keeping you up tonight, you're not alone, and I truly understand how that feels. At least your favorite historian was here to keep you company with some timeless tales and fascinating figures. I like to mix in a bit of everything: ancient empires, strange events, forgotten rulers, so there's always something to distract the mind and ease you into rest. It's late now, so close your eyes when you're ready. I've got a cozy fire crackling.
and a warm cup of tea by my side. Until next time, sweet dreams and good night.